Hi, and welcome to another sketchbook tour. I began watercolor painting as an absolute beginner in October of 2022 in a first sketchbook which I shared in a video previously, and I will add a link for that here if you're interested. And today I'll be sharing my second watercolor sketchbook, which I began in spring of 2023 when I had already been painting for 4 months. You will see that I have numbered my sketchbook. I've also dated it. And whenever I finish a sketchbook, I like to take a moment to reflect upon what I have done. I page through the sketchbook and I look at what struck me the most, or what I learned the most, or what had the most meaning to me. And from that, I make a little logo for each sketchbook to remind me of what's inside it. So this one has planets and crystals. And I also usually write a few words at the back of my sketchbook just to remind me of what was inside. So this one was cosmos and flowers, cacti and crystals. So if you're ready, let's dive right in. So I was actually traveling when I began this sketchbook. I was in Vuiagmeni, which is just south of Athens, on the seaside, an absolutely beautiful place, in February 2023. And my first spread is very inspired by the Domestika course that I had started then from Victoria Calderon on how to paint galaxies. And already I was inspired by her style because I was working through the course at that time. And these are meant to be abstract moonlit proteas. I don't know if they're recognizable, but I really liked her style, and I was doing something in a similar style, my version of it, as my first spread. And because I was working through her course on Domestika, you will see a lot of the exercises here in the sketchbook. The first half of the sketchbook is mostly dedicated to the lessons from that course I was working in my sketchbook. So one of the very first lessons was pressure and precision, where we were learning how to modify our brush strokes and paint really thin and precise brush strokes very close together while leaving very small negative spaces. And here I finally started experimenting with putting much more water to pigment ratio. And this was a significant improvement. If you have seen my first sketchbook video, 4 months prior to this, I was an absolute beginner and I made my very first marks on paper with watercolor. And it looked like wash. It looked like I was trying to paint with acrylic. It was absolutely terrible. And finally here I'm starting to use a bit of transparency. And this was a very welcome move forward for me. So I feel like there's already a little bit of progress, and throughout the sketchbook there was quite a bit of growth. A lot of it technical, so unfortunately, because it's a bit boring, you will see that there's a lot of brush practice. And the next page as well was a lot of brush practice, and it made the sketchbook quite boring, so I taped over it at the end. I decided to cover it up with something more interesting. So this is already from the end of the sketchbook. This is already from the end of April, 22nd of April. And by now I had finished the sketchbook and I came back and was sticking pieces of paper over the parts I found really boring with all of the brush marks that were very monotonous and repetitive. These were some crystals inspired once again by Victoria Calderon's work, which I found beautiful. And here I was working with my original pan set that I had purchased as my very first watercolor pan set from Schminke. And the colors, as you can see, are super vibrant and super strong. And I had put down masking fluid to limit the facets of each crystal and then just made patterns over it with Posca pen. Here I was already starting to diversify what I was doing. This was actually my very first painting where I was experimenting with underpainting. So this was something I had never done. And by the end of this sketchbook, this was on the 27th of April, I now felt confident enough to try something like underpainting. So I started with quite a simple subject with the blueberries, which I did an underpainting in cobalt blue with, and then I did the painting over it in indigo. And then I moved on to things that were a little bit more complex, such as the rose hips. I did a first version with an underpainting in blue, and then painting these in red over it, and it gave it quite a light, muted tone, compared to these guys where I did an underpainting in yellow. And already I saw the difference between warmer and cooler results just with the underpainting. And here as well I did an underpainting in yellow. So these were just some sketches which were already quite detailed, and I was very proud of these at the time. I found them quite technical, and I was extremely proud actually of being able to test something like underpainting and actually see the difference and the fact that it was visible to the naked eye. So these were quite good learning experiences at the end of the book. So it's not chronological order. I'm sorry about that. I do jump around sometimes in my sketchbooks. All of this is from the end of the sketchbook. So this is the 28th of April, and this is already a different course. So after I finished Anna Victoria Calderon's course, I started the one from Inga Buividavice on Domestika about loose botanical watercolor painting. It was a course I absolutely loved and fell in love with. So this was one of the lessons from the course about painting abstract, simplified botanicals. And then she encouraged us to find our own and start sketching. And at the time it was agapanthus season, and there were agapanthes everywhere in the neighborhood. I call them agapanthes. I think it's cute. And I absolutely love these flowers. So I was doing some loose watercolor sketches, and here is where a new paint starts coming into my sketchbook. It's the Daniel Smith range. So I had been painting with Schminke up until now because it is the most readily available paint in Switzerland. And Daniel Smith is something that you will not find in the paint shops here. You have to order it from overseas. It's a little bit complicated. You pay import taxes on it. And I'd been watching a few YouTube videos by now, and I saw quite a few people whose work I enjoyed working with Daniel Smith. So I went ahead and ordered a Daniel Smith dot card set, which contained 64 colors, if I remember correctly. And I went ahead and swatched all of those and started doing little sketches with them, and I fell in love with them. And a spark of madness was born, and I went on to have a full-blown obsession, which peaked in sketchbook number 3, and I will share in a future video very soon, probably the next one. But that really peaked in sketchbook number 3, where I went back and ordered 238 dots, the 238 colored dot cards, and I went and sketched with every single one of the 238 Daniel Smith colors to understand how they mixed, how they applied onto the paper, and which ones I wanted to order into my final palette. But this was just the beginning. This was dipping a toe into the river of madness and falling in love with it. And the effects already were beautiful. I was seeing some of this lovely granulation, and the colors were very vivid. And I found them a little bit more muted and natural, especially for the earth tones and the greens, than the Schminke colors, which were much more vibrant and sometimes obnoxiously bright, depending on what you wanted to paint. For things like crystals, it was perfect, and bright, shiny rose hips. But then for things like leaves and dried out flower shells, I found the Daniel Smith colors closer to nature, or my version of nature. So I really fell in love with these here. And moving on, there's quite a long stretch of more practice. So this is back to chronological order back in February from Anna Victoria Calderon's course. And as you can see, technically, I'm still very much a beginner here compared to 2 months later when I had already been splashing a lot of paint onto my paper. So this is still much more awkward and clumsy. And I'm learning how to do washes for the first time in my life here. I'm trying to do gradients. And there's a lot of learning to be done. Something I did not know back then was that if I don't want these backwashes and I don't want these cauliflower effects, I need to match the amount of water in my brush to the amount of water already on the paper. And first of all, I did not actually know that. I don't remember anyone mentioning it in a tutorial in those 2 classes that I'd done, and it would have been immensely helpful. I did figure that out for myself, and then I heard it in other lessons later and it made sense. But what I learned here was, the takeaway was that when I'm doing a wash, I want the same amount of water in my brush as is on the paper. And knowing that, first of all, was an experimentation process to find it out, but then applying it is also quite hard because you have to learn to judge the amount of water in your paintbrush. So these exercises I did quite a lot of. They were quite monotonous, but they really helped with mastering the technical aspect of the craft. Another one of the lessons from Anna Victoria's course was making these little experiments on textures. So things like dropping water, salt, alcohol, acetone into the watercolor. And the embarrassing part about this is that I was still in Greece when I was doing this, staying at a hotel. And in the afternoons, I would go down to reception, or in the evenings, and I would ask them for all sorts of weird stuff, such as, do you have fine salt, table salt, sea salt, flakes of salt? Do you have acetone? Do you have nail polish remover? Do you have alcohol? Yes, any alcohol. Can I have it in a little glass, please? And they thought that I was doing very weird things up in the room at night, when actually I was experimenting with watercolor textures. So goodness knows what they thought of me, but it was a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed some of these effects, especially the alcohol left these very nice halos, which remind me a little bit of floating bacteria or jellyfish. So I really enjoyed these. The salt as well, depending on the type of salt I was using or what the hotel was able to offer me that evening, made different effects as well. So these were interesting. And this was a good place to start. It was the kind of textures I'd never worked with. I found it quite messy, but very interesting to learn. And with this knowledge of textures, we went on to paint jellyfish. So this was another one of the lessons. And this was the first attempt. And I have to say, I am not particularly proud of it. I put on way too much paint, so I didn't get around to doing several layers. I just heaped on bunches of pigment in the first layer. It came out way too dark. I hadn't thought ahead and left out white space for the reflections to make the jellyfish look shiny. So while I had done textures with the salt and alcohol, and some of it was quite successful, I had completely forgotten to plan things like the shininess. So then I came back with white gouache, which was on the supplies list. I had bought it, I'd never used it, and this was my first time trying white gouache over watercolor. The watercolor was dry when I applied the gouache, and yet still it completely reactivated the watercolor underneath and was not very effective. So this also taught me that painting over watercolor with white gouache is not as perfect a solution as it looks like when you see other people do it on videos. It lifts the watercolor underneath, it gets messy, and it's not going to give you a perfect white. So I have since found another solution, which is the bleed-proof white, and that does give me a perfect white coverage. So this actually looked an absolute mess. I tried to recover it with curls and splatters. I don't think it did much for the painting, but it was my first attempt, and I had a lot of fun. And I had to try it again, so I gave it another shot. And here I was trying already to use the gouache in several layers to give it better reflections of a purer white. I feel like overall the effect here is a little bit better, also maybe a little bit more controlled and less messy. But basically I was having fun with jellyfish. And also I was at the seaside at the time. I liked the mixing of these colors. Some of them turned out quite beautiful. I really enjoy these backwashes here. So I decided to have another go. I went through a jellyfish obsession. There were a couple of days where in the evenings in my hotel room it was jellyfish time every night. And here I was just testing pretty much every color in my pan set. So I was just mixing 2 or 3 colors per jellyfish, and the goal was to test all of the colors in my pan set as jellyfish colors. Sorry about that. I've had to reposition because it does get uncomfortable after a while. Okay, so this was fun as well, and I feel like I was understanding a bit more now how I would want reflections and light to look. I was using a lighter load of pigment, so the jellyfish were more transparent. And by now I was actually becoming quite happy with it. So I was actually traveling with my partner at the time, and after him watching me going jellyfish crazy for a couple of days, he became intrigued and he proposed a Valentine's Day activity. So this is a painting date. This was a bit of a Valentine's painting date. This was from the 15th of February. I know it's not the right day, but it's the thought that counts. And what we did was we sat opposite each other, and he started painting, and then I basically copied him. So he wanted to paint his own jellyfish, and then I tried to do a version of his jellyfish at the same time, which was hilarious. So he did a beautiful wash with a lovely gradient, a bit of a light effect here. It looks like the sunlight is hitting the jellyfish through the water. It looks like the jellyfish is quite high up on the water, and the water line is sort of coming down here. And it was his first watercolor painting. Like, how is this possible? And he absolutely knocked it out of the ballpark. His jellyfish was so delicate and beautiful. And sitting opposite him, I am still trying to paint like it's gouache or acrylic. I'm massacring the paper, and I'm trying to paint a nighttime version of his jellyfish. So he's kind of got the day version, I've got the night version, or light to dark jellyfish. And I got a little bit frustrated by the end because I felt like his was so much prettier, and I was watching him work and I was trying to follow along and copy, and I don't feel like mine was as successful as his. So that wasn't very romantic. I feel like he could have tried harder. He could have painted worse, just for romance sake. But it was a lot of fun. It was a nice idea. And then we moved on to the final exercise in the course. So this is back to Anna Victoria's course. And this was the galaxy. So the whole course was teaching us techniques that we would apply to then paint a full-blown galaxy. And this was on the 1st of March. And so here we were using all of the, in the video, we're using all of the techniques with the alcohol, the salt. And what I didn't understand when I had looked at this course is that this is actually several layers. I imagined this as an easy 1 hour project. For example, for a double spread like this, it was not. This took me a whole day of faffing back and forth. So it was putting down an area, working, putting down an area, working, trying to incorporate lighter or different colored areas. Like I was trying to make a nebula effect here. I wouldn't call it incredibly successful, but the intention is there. And then you'd come back for a second layer and darken up and put different colors over it. This was actually longer and I would say more finicky than I thought it would be. But I'm very glad that I learned how to create an effect like this. And then when everything was dry, you had to come back and splatter the white paint. And then when that was dry, you came back and drew the little galaxies. So the whole thing was actually quite time consuming and quite finicky. But overall, I like the result. It's something interesting. And of course, I then wanted to start playing with it and applying it in different contexts. So I was sitting downstairs in the lobby and sketching drinks. And then I wanted to try the idea of having a galaxy in a latte cup, which the idea was good. The execution, well, leaves me underwhelmed. I definitely could have done this better. But the thought is there. It is a sketchbook. And I keep reminding myself that it's not a perfect book, it's a sketchbook. So the idea is to make sketches. And then if I wanted beautiful finished pieces, I would do that differently. And at least now I have learned. And these are meant to be galaxy mojitos. And once again, I really like the idea. I also like the brightness of the colors. This is the Schminke paints again. So for paintings like this, things like urban scenes, graphic scenes, I really enjoyed their colors. Because I found them a little bit more intense and less natural looking. So for this, for example, I loved the Schminke paints. And the idea is nice. It's something that I would do differently now if I had to put into a finished piece. But once again, it's a sketchbook and I had fun sketching it. It was on the Greek seaside. It's Galaxy Mojitos. It's nice. And after that course, I moved on to Inga Buividavice's course. And this was actually a whole different kettle of fish for me. I really found my momentum here and it resonated a lot more with me. Her style resonated very deeply with me, actually. And I loved her colors. And this is when I had started ordering the Daniel Smith dot cards. So you will already see some of the Daniel Smith colors mixed in, like the Mayan blue, the lunar blue, the moon glow, which has become probably one of my favorite colors of all time. So this one is a tritone color. It's got 3 different pigments in it. It's got a red, a blue, and Okay, I'm blanking here right now, which is so embarrassing because it is my favorite color and I could usually rattle this off the top of my head. But it is lovely. The variation and nuance in the moon glow is absolutely beautiful. The indigo is still the indigo from Schminke, as is the perylene green. And I must say, after having tried a few different brands, still to this day, the indigo and perylene green from Schminke are my favorite because they are the most colorful. And I do like an indigo with a bit more color. Same for the perylene green. I find the Daniel Smith and Winsor Newton ones slightly more desaturated. And so for these two colors in particular, I still prefer Schminke. The Undersea Green from Daniel Smith also, which has become one of my all-time favorite colors. Absolutely love this one. And then the Green Gold and Quinacridone Golds from Daniel Smith, which I use all the time and love. So with Inga, we started working on color again. So there was a whole section on color theory and color mixing, and this was really useful. She also presents very nice and interesting ways of doing your color swatches, and I was having a lot of fun with this. And her course really struck a lot of chords with me right from the beginning. She does do a lot of brush drills though. So there's a few pages of brush drills which I did not come back and cover up with paintings. So you will see a few of these. And I had started originally in October 2022 with 5 brushes. I only purchased 5. And here I had purchased, with the Daniel Smith paints, I'd also purchased another 4 or 5. No, it was 4. I purchased another 4 brushes. I purchased notably a quill brush, which had changed my life, and I've become a quill brush addict. It's almost the only thing I use nowadays. I bought a liner. I already had the square brush. I already had the round brushes. But here, basically, I went through my brushes again, even the 5 that I had started with, and I got really familiar with them. I got familiar with how much paint they can hold, how long a line they can make before they run out, how thick a line they can make, how thin a line they can make, what shapes they can make. And because all of these brush strokes got really monotonous, I did come back and cover them up. This was already on the 29th of April, so this is already, once the sketchbook is complete, I came back and covered these up. And this is when I was already going into the Daniel Smith obsessive phase, and I was swatching out those 238 colors. Amongst those 238 colors, this is when I was swatching the greens. So here I was doing colors like the green gold, the rich green gold as well, sap green. There's also, I think this is zoisite mixed in here, and then burnt sienna. So here I was already mixing the different greens and working with them. And also this is where I was really realizing that I truly enjoy painting succulents. It's one of my favorite subjects. I really like the symmetry and simplicity of their forms, and just coming back and painting these simple repetitive shapes is something that I find a very nice way of testing colors. So this was, yeah, just color testing already at the end. And more brush drills. So Inga does quite a lot of brush drills in her course, and I find this very useful because fundamentals, I think you can never do fundamentals too much. And taking the time and coming back with an experienced artist and watching them do fundamentals, and then going away and learning it on your end as well is something really useful. So here it was, once again, seeing brush pressure and variation and precision. So these were nice, and seeing, you know, the marks that you could make with each brush. And by now I was covering some more of them up. This is also from the end of the sketchbook, 30th of April. Once again, sketching with the greens, sap green, green gold, mix of sap green, green gold, and this is burnt sienna here. And then this is just the green gold. That dot on the dot card had so much green gold on it and sap green that I didn't know how to finish the samples anymore, so I was swatching a bunch of it, which is funny because on the dot card sometimes when it gets squeezed out, some of the colors you just have a tiny little smidgen of, and you can barely paint a little sketch with it, and then sometimes the dot is huge and you can paint like 3 pages with it, which was the case for the green gold here. some more brush drills. So testing my flat brush, which actually I don't use that much, even though I discovered that it makes sort of really nice curvy lines and nice grass shapes. And I should use it more because it's actually a very useful one. But I've become quite minimalistic with my brush use. I do use my quill brush for almost everything. And more brush practice. So just seeing the different shapes and composite brush strokes that you can make with a single brush. And then I came back and tried to make a composition with all the different brush strokes, just using brush strokes and brush marks. So this was a nice way to learn how to emulate botanical shapes using brush marks in an abstract and loose way. And that was actually a big chunk of one of her first lessons. So I did take my time and work through them quite meticulously. And then she went on to do her sort of textures and layers and effects lesson. So this was about using techniques like putting the paint wet and wet, blending wet and wet, using a clean brush to pull paint down, pulling thick paint down, putting too much water on. This is actually an effect I truly love, when you put down too much water. And then it forms quite a nice ring, like a dark edge around. And this is one of the reasons I also love the quill brush, is because it's quite easy to pick up a huge amount of water, and then you can get this effect of putting down too much water. Things like lifting, lifting of the whole, lifting with water, just lifting off certain lines, and things like blooms, which I have sort of come to embrace in certain situations. I used to think that this was a mistake, and I used to be terrified of this happening. And now it's something that I live with and enjoy in certain situations. So that was a good step forward. And Inga totally embraces them. So she was very helpful in her course in taking away that fear and that complex. Things like glazing and then masking fluid as well. This is when I started using a bit more masking fluid again. And dry brushing. Talking of the pulling lines, I did this exercise several times and I never managed to get the same effect as she does on her videos. So I wouldn't get this fading out effect. There would always be a hard line at the end as it dried. And no matter how I tried to pull it down, as it dried, this would happen. And then I understood when I tried this on Arches paper, because I ordered a block of Arches paper later on and did these on Arches paper that I cut out. I understood immediately that actually this was not me, this was the paper. So this is 250 GSM cotton watercolor paper versus the 300 GSM, which is thicker and holds water in a very different manner. And as soon as I changed paper, all of my effects looked different. And so as a beginner, when I kept hearing people saying, oh, the paper you use is so important, it's not just marketing. They're not just trying to sell you product. It's actually true. And I didn't want to believe this because I'm really a skeptic of anyone telling me to buy more expensive stuff. But it really did make a world of difference. So I have understood that on this paper there will be limitations, and now I've actually come to embrace it and enjoy it. I like the fact that it is a sketchbook. It is cheaper. The paper is also of a cheaper quality. It will buckle, it will hold water differently, it will dry differently, the edges will be imprecise, harder. And I've actually enjoyed that because then when I do take a sketch and move it up to a higher quality watercolor paper, the result is already so much prettier. So it makes me feel quite satisfied when my final work is prettier without me having done much more of an effort. And I feel like this forces me to work harder to get a nice effect. So I feel like it keeps me on my toes and it makes my sketchbook look a little bit rough around the edges. So it is something I've come to embrace, and I do enjoy having a less successful paper for my sketchbook. As crazy as that sounds. So this is still from Inga's class as well. I was just trying to get different effects again. And as you can see, the pulling without that hard drying actually in this sketchbook doesn't work. It is a feat of agility to get that working in here, whereas on some Arches or Saunders waterfit paper, that would just work on its own. That would just be so easy. What was very useful as well was looking at the diffusion according to how long the drying time is. So you put some water down and drop the paint in at 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and to see how far the paint spreads. And this is where the Daniel Smith madness is starting. So I had ordered the 64 color dot cards initially, and here I was testing the quinacridone family from the coral, red, rose, pink, fuchsia, lilac, and purple. And the idea was to just try the same little sketches with each color and to see how they laid on in a thick consistency, light consistency, medium consistency, and with glazing little details over it. And what I realized is that the colors actually, even though they're all quinacridones, they vary quite a lot in terms of how they apply to the paper. The pink in particular, if you look, does not apply smoothly. It's got this sort of greasy feel to it. You can really see the brush strokes in the paint. The coral a little bit as well, you can see, but not so much, particularly the pink. So while the red, for example, goes on super smooth, and there's none of that streaky greasiness, in the coral, in the pink, and in the rose a little bit as well, you can see how super streaky and almost greasy this paint is. So that is something to bear in mind if you're looking at the quinacridones from Daniel Smith, is that the texture in them is not the same. And the smoothest ones are going to be the fuchsia and lilac, well, particularly the fuchsia and the red. So the red was actually, I think, overall the smoothest, followed by the fuchsia. And then in terms of the stickiest one, really the pink, followed by the rose and coral. So those ones are already harder to work with. And this is where I actually just swatched out independently the 64 colors from the dot cards. Some of them struck me immediately, so I was testing how transparent they are, how well they lift, and how well they glaze. And I immediately fell in love, for example, with the Quin Gold and the Aussie Red Gold. This is actually on my palette to this day. I love how bright it is and how you can vary from sort of a nice russet orange to a nice yellow. So I found that really interesting in its variation. There's also these shiny colors. So this is part of the Primatech range, the bronzite, and there's a few more that we'll see in a moment that are sparkly, and they're actually quite subtle. I don't know how much you can pick this up on camera, but there's a bit of sparkle in them, like small sparkly, like little particles. And these were quite nice. This was a nice discovery because they're not fully iridescent. They just have the most delicate little sparkle on them. So if you're not into the metallics, this is a very nice in-between. Here we have another one. This is the red fuchsite. So this has a little bit of a sparkle. There we go. You can see some of those little flecks of sparkle in there. Garnet Genuine also was another color that really struck me as being particularly beautiful. Here are all the quinacridones. And once again, if you see the quinacridone pink, you can see how streaky it is. You can really see the brush strokes in the paint, and the coral you can see as well, whereas the Quin Red, you can just see how beautifully that spreads. And in the blues and purples, I particularly like the Wisteria and Lavender. These are two interesting colors. They are opaque. You can see they're quite opaque compared to a normal watercolor, and they do have a bit of a white pigment to them, and they are, which gives them this pastel feeling. So they are pastel, and they are very nice. I found these very beautiful summery spring colors. The Sugulite and the Kyanite are two more of these shimmering paints, and these two I really fell in love with because this is like a lovely soft warm silver, and then the Kyanite is like this moody blue gray, and these two I have on my palette as well. I absolutely love them. Amethyst is much more powerful, so this is a purple sparkly one, and it's much shinier and much stronger. It does kind of overpower everything else if you're using this one. So if you're looking for a very strong sparkly purple pigment, this is the way to go. But if you're looking for something more muted and toned down, these two are gorgeous. And then the blues. And actually I was disappointed because I found the number of blues on their dot card insufficient. I'm a blue girl. It's my favorite color. I would have wanted to try 20 different blues, and there were only about 4 of them. So I was a little bit frustrated in the number of blues. And this is already when I understood that I would have to order the 238 color dot card. Some of the interesting ones as well were the Prima texts. So all of these Prima texts were quite interesting. Where you see the word genuine, it's one of the Prima texts that's made from genuine natural pigments, apparently. And a lot of them have very interesting granulating or two-tone effects, like the serpentine, which in real life looks like a mix of a dusty pink with a green, and the jadeite, which looks like a warm brown mixed with a dark green, for example. So those are quite interesting. And then the iridescents were, well, very iridescent. And once again, some of them have a two-tone effect. So those are the duochromes. And the duochromes look like a mixture of different colors. We'll see more of these in a moment. The interference you will not be able to judge so well in the sketchbook because they show up best on a dark surface. So if I hold it to the light, you can sort of see what the interference looks like on a dark surface. The duochrome, which I mentioned, is interesting because this looks, when you look at it closer, it looks like a mix of two different pigments. So for example, the jade looks like a mix of bronze and green. And then the Seguro green looks like a mixture of sort of gold and green. And the Cabo blue is a mix of gold and blue. So these were very nice, actually, and I did not realize how much I would come to love these. I do have 2 or 3 tubes of these by now, and they're very, very nice to paint with. You'll see some more on the next pages. So now I had the dot cards already, the smaller version, the 64 that I swatched out here. So these are the 64 colors from the smaller dot card series. And here I started sketching with these already, and this is back to Inga's course. One of the exercises from Inga's course is making planets. So here I was testing the different colors. I was already falling in love with the Blue Apatite Genuine, which is a color I have on my palette as well. The garnet here as well, even diluted, is very beautiful. And here I was making some watermelon inspired planets. Yeah, my imagination does what it does some days. Some days it works out, some days it falls flat. This is obviously a day I was trying and not finding much to go on. But watermelon planets and some greens. Some of them were interesting. The serpentine genuine actually was lovely for this because the green already looks like it has a pink mix into it when it granulates. So this is something I have on my palette as well, and it's something I use interchangeably with the sap green. Moving on to the blues, and one I particularly liked was the Sodalite Genuine. This is also a Primatech color. I have this one on my palette, and this is what I use instead of Payne's Gray. So I don't actually have a Payne's Gray. I use this one because it's more pigmented. I like the fact that it's got more blue to it and isn't so gray, and it granulates beautifully, and you can make really nice effects with it. You know, there's a storm starting to come in. When I started filming, it was so sunny and beautiful, and now it has become overcast, and there's some thunder rumbling in the distance. So if you can hear any of that, I'm sorry. But I will try and finish up before it becomes completely dark. The Mayan blue actually is a color that I was inspired to try because I saw Inga using it, and it looked beautiful, and I love the color. However, it is super streaky and a little bit greasy as well. So this is another one that is hard to paint with. While the color is beautiful, it is actually hard to paint with it. So this one I have on my palette, but I almost never touch it, even though I love the color. This was testing the sparkly ones, so the Kyanite, which was the dark moody blue, the Sigulite, which was the soft silver, and then the Amethyst, which is that very intense purple. And the sparkle does come through, but it is subtle. It is very subtle, and I find that the sparkle has faded actually since painting it. So this was in April, not yet, sorry, March of last year, and yeah, already the sparkle has faded quite a lot, and it's not because it's rubbed up on the opposite page. There's actually none of it that's rubbed off here, which is good news. It doesn't rub off. It just doesn't sparkle as strongly anymore. So that is something that does fade a little bit with time. And here I was testing the different iridescence and the different duochromes. I did also more tests with these in a next sketchbook, in the third one, where I went through the whole Daniel Smith obsessive madness, where I did the 238 colors. But here I was already starting to test them individually, and I'll let you have a look at them. Some of them I particularly loved. The cactus flower is a very pretty color. The sunstone I really like. This is a beautiful rose gold, actually. So I don't know why they call it sunstone, because it clearly is a warm rose gold. Very beautiful. The duochromes I ended up loving. So the ones like the carbo blue, the emerald, I really loved. And yeah, here's where you can see the iridescent sunstone, which is a very beautiful rose gold color. And then the sugilite and the kyanite, which I absolutely love. A comment about the iridescence and all of these sparkly ones. They're beautiful, but the pigments are quite heavy and they don't adhere to the paper. So when you put it down, the pigments are floating in the water. They will settle to the bottom, and then you can poke them around with your brush forever, it feels like. And as soon as any water drops on, you can poke them around again. So they're very, very easy to move around. And they don't really bloom because they're quite heavy. They just sit at the bottom, and then you can just move them around, almost like sand at the bottom of an aquarium. That's what it felt like. But as soon as you paint over it with the second layer, it activates everything. Everything just gets washed away. No matter how delicately you paint, it does wash away. You know, even when you're going over it with your brush super lightly, as soon as you put on a second layer, it completely washes away what's underneath. So these ones do not attach to the paper at all. Like, they will dry to where you have put them, but as soon as you add any more water again, they are mobile and floating everywhere. Carrying on with Inga's course, these were exercises on feathers. I'm having a bit of a giggle here because they actually look like aubergines, but these are my aubergine shaped feathers. I'm still guilty of using way too much pigment, but by now I'm enjoying my colors, like the undersea green I'm loving. And the Mayan blue, here you can see how streaky that is with the brush strokes in it. And you can see that in the actual paintings as well, that the Mayan blue absolutely does not diffuse as well as the other colors. So for example, here the undersea green diffuses beautifully. The Mayan blue just does not. Here as well, the perylene green diffuses beautifully, where this is indigo and undersea green diffuses beautifully. But the Mayan blue will just sort of sit there in sort of greasy lumps, which is something to be aware of. If that's a texture you're going for, perfect. But if you're looking for a soft diffuse texture, this is not going to be the right consistency for it. So here we're just practicing things like lifting along the edges, gradients, masking fluid, a few splatters, which I've started to enjoy more and more. I still have almost zero control and intentionality over them, but I really enjoy them. And here I was finishing the swatches from those 68 colors from Daniel Smith. So here I was just doing some Wisterias, moving from the Wisteria color at the top to the quinacridone violet at the bottom, which was the darker purple. And very soft. I did end up buying this one for my palette. It's a very soft, beautiful pink, cool pink. The lavender up here, moving into the quinacridone purple at the bottom. And this, once again, is something I picked up, the lavender, for my palette because it's a very beautiful blue, well, lavender blue. It is. It says on the tube, and it is what's in the tube. And here, this is imperial purple mixing down to quinacridone magenta. Thankfully, we're approaching the end of the sketchbook because it has gotten so dark and gloomy suddenly. And this is testing the greens, green gold, serpentine genuine, and you can see this lovely mix of sort of pinkish pigments that come out as it granulates. The green apatite. I had so much green gold that I ended up mixing it into everything just to try and use it. So this is a green gold on its own, and here I was already mixing it with the apatite genuine and with the jadeite and with the zoisite. So you'll see that I've been trying to get rid of my green gold actually. Some of the colors were super interesting. So yeah, the apatite green is sort of like a dark sap green with a bit of Once again, a bit of brownish, warm brownish pigments in it. The serpentine has is a bit of a yellow green with sort of pinkish pigments to it. The jadeite and the diopside are darker. Cascade green, this was an interesting color. It does granulate quite well, and it's an interesting sort of mental bluish green, which I don't really find much use for in my painting, but it's a very pretty color if you do paint subjects that would work with that pigment. And the zoisite, this one I found quite complicated. It's extremely granulating, and it's almost like a perylene green, but it's got like a yellowish green base with a deep brownish pigment that rises up to the top when it granulates. And I did experiment more with that in my next sketchbook to see how I could use that to its advantage. And just finishing up with more of Inga's exercises from the Domestika course, some more planets, trying to mix different colors by now, and some moths. So here I was just copying her work and trying to achieve the same effects because I found it beautiful, and I love her color palette actually. So I was trying to find ways of making that my own or recreating it with what I had at home. And the last pages by now were quite an exuberant explosion of Daniel Smith colors. So by now I had found a few Daniel Smith colors I was loving. Here we have some of the green gold, Mayan blue. There's also a bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna here. Here we have the same colors, except that we have the Schminke indigo and the Schminke perylene green as well. So this was already quite chaotic, and I absolutely loved it. There's a mix of some salt in here. You can see a little bit of texture at the bottom of these cacti here. And then there's a mix of dropping water, painting with a wet brush, touching edges, going back over some stuff with Posca pen at the end, splattering wildly. And one thing I learned from Inga's course that I really enjoyed was how to finish the page, because I would just have painted these elements on and considered it finished, but she goes and adds these little splatters that are quite intentional, or she adds little patterns to finish it, and the whole thing, it just brings it together, which is something I really enjoyed. For example, here on these planets as well, she goes and adds these little decorations in between, which pulls the whole page together and really blurs, I would say, the line between your little subjects and the white page. It sort of pulls your subjects onto the page and merges them. So this was something that I really enjoyed from her style, and I went and had a lot of fun going wild with that here. And that's how I ended the sketchbook, on an explosion of Inga Buividavice inspired botanicals. So this is actually what the course works up to in Domestika. It works up to painting a loose flower, a watercolor flower or botanical scene. And I try to do my version of that for this final spread here. This was in April of 2023. I was already working now with the mix of Daniel Smith and Schminke watercolors, and I really had a lot of fun with some of these shapes. I enjoyed making these loose abstract leaves in particular, I found beautiful, and I enjoyed bringing it together with these little random circles and splatters. And that's how this adventure ended. If you have stayed this far, thank you so much for having watched this video. Please let me know that you've made it to the end by leaving a word in the comments. Today's word is crystals, because there were a lot of them in this sketchbook, and I hope you enjoyed it. It's such a pleasure to have shared this with you. Thank you and have a lovely day. Bye.